Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. In this lecture, as we conclude our look at westward expansion in the years leading up to the Civil War, we're going to talk about the aftermath of the Mexican War and the Wilmot Proviso. At the conclusion of the previous lecture, we talked about some of the results and outcomes from the Mexican War. Let me just review quickly some of those before we move on to discussing the Wilmot Proviso. We talked about the tremendous territorial gain as a result of this war. Much of what becomes the southwestern part of the United States was gained in the aftermath of this war. I mentioned many of the soldiers and officers who gained experience in the Mexican War who would then go on to serve in the Civil War. Also, I mentioned the strained relations between the United States and Latin America, and in particular Mexico. We talked about the casualties on both sides. And then I concluded by mentioning the expansion of slavery into these territories becomes the most pressing question confronting the nation in the years leading up to the Civil War. And so it's to that question that we're going to turn in this lecture. Before we get to the political ramifications of the war in the United States, let's talk a little bit about what happened to the Mexicans who were living in that vast territory that then became part of the United States. They found themselves overnight being part of one nation and then the next morning being part of another nation. And this transition for many of them was difficult because for the most part Americans criticized and didn't especially welcome the Mexicans who were living on their own land before that conflict ever started. Also bear in mind that the year after the Mexican War ended launched the gold rush. And so the Anglo population in that territory surged in the aftermath of the war, while the Mexican population may have increased slightly, but certainly didn't keep up with the number of Americans who were coming in. Now, initially, Mexicans who were annexed into the United States were allowed to vote, but most Americans didn't like it. As one newspaper wrote, "We are opposed to allowing an ignorant crowd of Mexicans to determine the political questions in this country where a man is supposed to vote knowingly and thoughtfully." So many states implemented the same kinds of restrictions used to limit the black vote after the Civil War, even when blacks were legally allowed to vote. They might have a test at the polls or a poll tax, so these same kinds of political restrictions were imposed on Mexicans. Mexicans also found their rights to the land were hindered in many cases. The rancheros, who I described to you as a prosperous group prior to the Mexican War, and had held possession of the land for many years, in some cases for generations, could rarely provide any proof of such ownership, and they frequently lost their land for any number of reasons. Among them might be squatters simply moving in. We've talked about similar cases among Native American groups. The rise and fall of the cattle industry. So anytime there might be a down year, white prospectors might swoop in and take over their land. Also, things like the weather and drought, again, could contribute to a bad year when they might be forced to sell their land. And in many cases, there were new tax laws implemented, laws that taxed the land, not the product that was being produced. And so, again, a bad year or two could bankrupt a rancher. And so for all of these kinds of reasons, Mexican rancheros increasingly saw themselves dispossessed of land that they had owned for many, many years prior to the Mexican War. And increasingly, Mexicans were used as laborers in ranching and farming. They might dig irrigation ditches. They also worked on the railroads in the West and in mining in some cases as well. But with rare exceptions, Mexicans were the workers and Anglos were their managers and supervisors. Mexicans were also typically paid less for the same work that white workers might do. At the same time, Mexicans did have a great deal of pride and self-respect, and they pushed back against these kind of limitations often. Some of this takes us beyond our period ending in 1877, but Mexican workers did at times go on strike. That increased more in the 20th century. And they also established mutualistas, which are mutual benefit associations or benevolent associations. And this is a picture of one such group here, symbolic of the great ethnic solidarity among Mexicans. These benevolent associations provided hospital and funeral expenses for members, provided loans or money for people in need. So these are examples of Mexicans, even while they are struggling as a group and a lot of restrictions being put upon them, they still resist and manage to withhold their own sense of identity and independence. For Americans, the aftermath of the Mexican War raised great questions. What would become of the newfound territory and the states that were sure to evolve out of that territory? For someone like Abraham Lincoln, who, as I mentioned earlier, was opposed to the war in the first place, these questions provided a launching point from what would become one of the great political careers in all of American history. As Lincoln said in 1848, Whigs, that is W-H-I-G-S, his political party, Whigs did not believe in enlarging our field, but in keeping our fences where they are and cultivating our present possessions, making it a garden, improving the morals and education of the people. And yet most Southerners and slaveholders supported the addition of this new territory under the promise that it would bring many new slaveholding states into the Union. Bringing this debate out into the open was Congressman David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, who introduced a measure called the Wilmot Proviso, which proposed that slavery be banned in all the territory acquired from Mexico. The proviso caused a firestorm of controversy and debate in Congress. Ultimately, it passed in the House, but was defeated in the Senate, where slave and free states were divided equally. But the Wilmot Proviso provided a point of discussion and debate around which the rest of the country could formulate arguments related to slavery and its extension into the territories in the West. So we see a range of thoughts on this in this time. From the one extreme of the Northern abolitionists who posed the immediate abolishment of slavery and the equality of the freed slaves thereafter. That was one extreme. The other extreme was John C. Calhoun's view in the South, that slavery should be allowed everywhere as a right. And so in between those two extremes, we see a range of options, one of them being the Wilmot Proviso. Leave slavery alone where it stood at that time, but prevent it from spreading into any of the new territories. Others had other proposals. President Polk proposed that the Missouri Compromise line simply be extended all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and anything south of that line would be a slave state, and anything north of it would be a free state. Others proposed the idea of popular sovereignty, that the people in each territory could vote whether to be adopted as a state that would be slave or be free. What we're going to see going forward is that all of these different possibilities are put on the table, and in some cases erupt into fierce debate in Congress. And ultimately, it is this question of the extension of slavery into the territories, more than any other, that pushes us towards the Civil War.